one, go. When you are unsure of your economic, political, and social standing, it is often better to hedge your bets and choose community. We on Affirmative suggest that ignorance is not just bliss, it is peace and it is stability. We will defend, for example, pursuing the choice to belong in a religious community with strong communal values, such as like the Amish, or for example, the Black theologists in the 1960s. We would suggest that we are comparing ourselves directly to a secular society that has three important characteristics. The first characteristic is that there is some modicum of religion and some varying interpretations of different kinds of religion. This, yes?
What's happening?
Bea, we can hear you. It's going all good.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, not anymore.
We'll check if.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe. Can you ask Mikko to go to his room?
Yeah, I don't know if you want. You probably.
Yeah, go lang, go lang. Yeah, we're gonna go check on them downstairs. We'll be right back.
Yep.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you can.
Yes, all good.
Hi, so I'm presuming that I am audible and
Yes,
visible
you
right now as well. Okay. 3, 2, 1, let's go. I'm doing it from the start, to be clear. Sorry. 3, 2, 1, let's go. When you are unsure of your economic, political, and social standing, it is often better to hedge your bets and choose community. We would suggest on Affirmative that ignorance is not just bliss, it is peace and it is stability. We would suggest that you, as the individual, should choose to opt into religious communities with strong communal values, such as the Amish, such as Black theologists in the 1960s, in comparison to secular societies that we would suggest have three key characteristics. The first characteristic is that they have some different kinds of religions and varying interpretations of those varying religions. Second, it is often also not just that you are choosing to believe or subscribe to a certain religion or a certain sect of religion, but it's also to other forms of social forces that operate similar to a religion and dictate your choices in life. Things like capitalism, the patriarchy, other forms of idolatry. The third is that they would suggest that the prerequisite to be able to make a meaningful decision on what secular or what religion you want to choose is choice. But we would suggest that secular society often makes the choice difficult insofar as these different religions and different sects of religions are in direct competition with each other through putting each on other gods or, for example, other doctrines and other ways of living. What I'm first going to prove at Prime Minister is that it is improved your quality of life should you choose government model. What does the individual want? There are 4 levels. The first level is that you probably want economic facilities. You are unsure as to whether or not you are rich, middle class, or poor. And insofar as if you are born rich, you would be fine. But in the instances in which you are born middle class or poor, it is quite preferable that the world that you are born into increases the likelihood for you to have alternative forms of economic stability. Second, you are uncertain of what social support systems you have outside of religion. Things like family that genuinely care about you, friends that want to listen to you, the individuals that will listen to your problems, empathize with you, and be there for you when you cannot be strong for yourself. Third, it is welfare systems. You are unsure as to whether or not the government that you are born into is one that will take care of your best interests, and therefore you are looking for other social structures that will be able to support you and make sure you have food on the table. Fourth, you do not know what you will believe in, and you also don't know your characteristics. If you're straight, or if you're gay, if you're liberal or progressive, And therefore, it is likely that whichever world you are born into is probably the means by which you will learn more or less about the world. We would suggest that a society with strong religious communal values is preferable on the basis of these four interests for 6 reasons. The first reason is because the support is likely. Insofar as these communities with strong communal religious values have a stronger sense and expectation of goodness, of selflessness, of giving back to other individuals, of respecting, for example, the elders and respecting other individuals within your own locality. Second, this support becomes exponential or at least stable over time, insofar as the capacity to have crowdfunding, to borrow money from your neighbors, for example, to be able to fulfill your basic needs, especially when you are in need, increase likely and defeat the concept of financial anxiety. Third, often you are unlikely to be forced into individualistic, unfulfilling forms of work and acquiring economic facilities that are often inherent in these fragmented secular societies. But fourth, your personal happiness, fulfillment, and emotional benefit is more likely to occur, especially since on opposition, the way that you will confide is very unlikely. The ability to choose to confide in someone and the ability to have success in confiding in someone is unlikely, insofar as you are likely to have the disagreements inherent to living in a very secular society, wherein the people you talk to and the people you confide in may have very different ideas of how you should go about personal choices or moral choices in life. The reason is because it also improves your understanding of the self and religious identity. On government, you are raised with one specific doctrine, one specific God, one specific way of living that are often affirmed by the people around you. Whereas on op, you are constantly confused and challenged by the world around you, by the different religions and sects that are constantly trying to make you doubt the way you live and doubt your God. We would suggest that ignorance is bliss, but it is unlikely that you will feel that the terrible effects of that ignorance, insofar as you are unlikely to be introduced to alternate ways of living and alternate ways of practicing a religion that would preclude a lot of the conflict that you would confront yourself with. Before I explain why in instances of bad societies, this would still be good, go, Tobi.
All of this assumes that you have no information about the outside world. Even in the most isolated religious communities, you're probably exposed to what other people think. How do you reconcile that conflict of value?
So it's all about degrees, right? In a world wherein you are in a secular society, the propensity for you to be introduced to other sects of society and for it to become a loud majority is increasingly more likely. In our world, you are socialized first and foremost to believe what is normal within your own community, but first and foremost are less likely to be bombarded with those narratives. And therefore, the degree to which you experience doubt and experience like questioning yourself is significantly less likely and significantly less likely to affect you in a way that is negative. Next, on instances of bad societies. In the instance in which this is true, there are 3 things we want to say at the top level of this argument. The first thing we want to say is that the incentive to keep the commune alive at least ensures that your bare necessities for higher quality of living are met. So for example, they're likely to ensure food, shelter, protections from outside conflict, insofar as individuals or community with strong religious communal values recognize that they have an obligation to this community and therefore are likely to protect not just the broader community, but the people within it. Second, it is also the capacity to rise up against oppression, insofar as there may be a fracturing between individuals that are to some degree have some bad comments or, for example, some qualms with the current existing society. They're more likely rather to coalesce because they have a shared understanding of where they are coming from. They have a sense of relatability that it becomes easier for them to coalesce and empathize and understand with each other in comparison to secular societies wherein the inherent differences you have not just make it different for you to understand where you're coming from, but to also make it difficult to open up the conversations that serve as a prerequisite to be able to coalesce and challenge against the status quo. But third, even in instances wherein reforming, for example, is difficult, the community is and the community is uncertain as to whether or not you would get that reformation, it is still okay. Because the belief that you have a community that values togetherness, that champions empathy, that provides someone that understands you, in comparison to a secular society where it is very difficult to guarantee that in all instances for every type of individual that would exist, you would have that type of support system. It is difficult for you to feel safe, to feel comforted. And we think that feeling of security is important insofar as it determines whether or not you would be happy on the day-to-day. At Prime Minister alone, we achieve 3 following things. The first thing we achieve is that we create multiple structures that support you, ensure that you are fed, ensure that you are protected, and ensure that you are happy from a self-actualization standpoint. The second thing we prove is instances of bad governance, there's forms of accountability and change for different institutions that may exist within this community. The third thing we prove is that even in the instances in which you cannot change them, the fact that the community exists means that you are given solace at the end of the day. Propose.
And thank the Prime Minister for that speech. To open case for side opposition to the leader of opposition. Here, here.
They are fleeing the seats to go downstairs to try and fix their Wi-Fi. So I will wait until they get there. In the meantime, I hope you're all having
Sure.
food.
So some judges have texted me saying, if you're asking POI from the same device, just be a little louder because it was slightly softer. So just flagging that.
No worries. I mean, they're no longer going to be in this room, I think.
Okay, great, thanks.
In the meantime, while we wait, I guess you can just like look at my face.
We wanted the vote for us, man.
Come on. Don't do me like that, man. We're on stream.
Oops.
We good now? Yes.
Can you ask him to say the motion? Can you say the motion, David?
Can I say the motion? Okay. If I knew what the motion was, that would be. Let me just pull it up. Saying the motion.
Scroll down.
Great. Saying the motion.
Down. Down.
Okay, the motion. I have been asked to say the motion. Under the veil of ignorance, this house as an individual would choose to be born in a religious society, religious community with strong communal values. As opposed to
Perfect. That's
secular
the
society.
motion.
That really is the motion. Thank you. Are we good, start?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Starting, I'll take POIs in chat. Starting my speech. Shout out to May, who is watching. Love you. Mikko made fun of me in front of my girlfriend. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Gov argues stability, but the religious gamble has always been a leap of faith with no safety net. And let's make it clear, even if these communities were better, it is a cruel, cruel thing to give them this taste of bliss only to have it be ripped away inevitably by the forces of economics, of globalization, and inevitability. Some setup. The veil of ignorance means that you have no idea what you will be. No idea whether you agree with this religion or if you're born in the majority for whom this religion would be good for. We will argue to you structurally that most people are actually born in the minority and most people are excluded. The second thing is that they say, well, you know, these secular societies are really evil and really mean without really ever responding to an actual counterfactual. We just suggest that they're not religious, they're not immoral. If these religions are so good, they will exist in a limited form without coercive communal forces as they exist now, where in fact most moderate Christians still live in secular societies and they can still believe in God without being forced into it by a gigantic religious force. So I have 2 responses to their case before I move on to the argument. The first is on their broad point about how there's an expectation of goodness, helping elders, etc. So there are 3 easy responses. The first is that this all depends on you having the community roll the right values. There's a very good chance that the community instead says the best way to help people is to make them suffer and strive towards that ideal of goodness by being able to do things on their own and not give them help. Like, for example, prosperity gospel. So there's a very good chance that maybe you might try to get help, but it does so in a way that's particularly destructive to you. There's no reason for why this kind of help would be good. But secondly is that this all relies on there being no doubt, when the whole point of their second argument is that these people come together and rise up against bad societies and constantly doubt and constantly check and balance. For this to be true, then it could only work in such a case where there is massive amounts of doubt for that community and its ability to provide for you, which means that they can either have their second argument or their first argument. In either world, God is losing. Argument 1, religious communities are organized on the basis of exclusion. Imagine being born as a Mormon and having to suppress your sexuality for the rest of your life, or as a woman who is born into a religious community that feels very strongly she should not have a job, she should not be able to fight for her own liberties. The first point we want to make is that most, if not all, religious communities with a strong community focus are based on the exclusion of others. 3 reasons. 1, they're built on the sense of unique salvation requires the demonization of certain traits in order for you to feel like that salvation is special and meaningful. Secondly, people who have different interpretations and traits of that doctrine are likely to be excluded or shut down because of the fact that they're breaking community values and they're rocking the boat. But thirdly is that typically these religions need a scapegoat for failures and problems in their life to displace that blame from the failures of the people in charge charge, which means maybe they can have people unionize and rise up. The problem is that in most of these conservative communities and these religious communities, they rise up against homosexuals, they rise up against Black people, they rise up against minorities that these leaders direct you to, which means that they either blame people inside, in which case you're not safe, you're not stable, or they blame people outside and they continue to be far worse, more racist, more bigoted people. The second point is that even if religions happen to be nice by accident, which is engaging with Gov's case, strong communal values exacerbate the most radical and fundamentalist aspects of these communities for three reasons. Number one, the attachment of religion to communal values makes it hard to speak up and hard to have a moderating voice, which means that it's always going to be the feeling of internal guilt when you think or stray away from something else than to find what's happiest for you. Secondly, is that anyone who does speak up is forced to leave or face a social punishment and sanction, like for example, the self-flagellation of people in Opus Dei, which means that in many, many cases, these strong communal values mean that these communities get more and more radical over time as moderate influences get excluded and the community gets left behind in the wake of traditionalism. But thirdly is that typically these communities are built on unattainable goals like that salvation, like being able to cleanse yourself of the uncleansable sin in order to maintain power, which means that you're far more likely to have cult leaders that potentially take charge, or at minimum, leaders that put the hope of salvation and the hope of stability dangling in front of you, which means that it's not based on stability, it's based on instability and forcing you to constantly chase after the ideal of that religion. What is the impact of this? Trivially, number one, we flip most of their impacts. The feeling of contentment doesn't come because the purpose of religion is to make you discontent and hope for that salvation from God. Secondly is that most people by luck end up with some trait, sexual preference, or racial feature that denies them access to important services like economics and so on, which means you're denied access to these things that you would not be denied in a secular society that would give it to you independent of these characteristics, which means most people are not denied these things on opposition, are denied it on government bench. But finally is that even if this is a 10% chance or a 20% chance you're born as a minority, could you imagine taking that risk where 90% of the time you get like a potentially nice thing that would be nice to have, and 10% of the time you're freaking oppressed for the rest of your life? This is just not a worthy trade-off. The counterfactual is simple. Secular society is way better because there's a host of mechanisms to make you happy. Where secularization guarantees free expression, which lets minority groups unionize and band together, the mechanism that Gov wanted to claim. And secondly, is that they can choose the parts and communities in life they want to do. So even if you're born into a conservative family, they can vote to change the society they're in, for example. They can leave and go to a nicer community, and they're not kept there by the threat of religion. And beyond that, even if one community is bad or two communities are bad, they can always spread that out and hedge amongst different communities, so that if one is bad, they can go to the university community where they have friends there, they can go to one where they have town participation or communal democracy, which you don't need religions to find happiness and security in. I'll take that POI.
So the alternative you just identified still has the problem of people feeling conflicting values, especially as they have to assimilate into different kinds of communities. The socialization means that the doubt that precedes your argument does not take place in the first place. At least engage with that material.
No, it doesn't, because it gives people the opportunity to choose to intellectually contemplate these values, and most of all, ensconce themselves in a community that doesn't always make them feel insecure. Argument two, it's worse for the majority. Even the most religious and well-suited people come to doubt themselves sincerely and honestly on government bench. One, when they see abuses in their own community that makes them doubt if this community is really that good. Two, when they get inevitably both exposed to the outside due to globalization and economics. And three is when they rebel against their parents just because they're like shitty kids, right? So these strong community values prevent you from exploring who you truly are and what you are, which means you will, one, always regret not knowing. Like kids who go through a Springer and come back and feel guilty for enjoying the pleasures of the world, despite the fact that they will have just been happier there. But secondly, that these communal values are designed to make you unhappy and discontent, where religion relies on fulfilling the same values over and over again, which triggers a hedonic treadmill and makes you get used to this, meaning that form of happiness gets less and less pleasurable over time. But they also weaponize guilt, such that even if you're happy in the moment, you feel doubt and insecurity about constantly changing or thinking about doing anything else. Thirdly is the lack of accountability. Even if the values are good and perfect, the reason for why people can't rise up on government bench is because the feeling like you're always being watched, the feeling like you might go to hell if you rise up, and always doubting if you're the right one here, and because of the fact it's intertwined with feelings of hell, intertwined with feelings of self-guilt. These external forces, in addition, will rip it away from you, even if it is a good community, like secular society expanding massively and causing members of your religion to leave because it's just not profitable to work in a secluded cult anymore. And in addition to this, the religious conflict like between Sunnis and Shias that expose you to the strongest forms of doubt, where these communities make it much more difficult for you to feel that faith in that community. The counterfactual is much simpler. Secular society maximizes individual liberty. It's the belief that you can strive towards something you chose that gives you hope and resilience even in the hardest of times, and beyond that allows you to choose this community for yourself rather than hope the one you found and was born into was the one for you. That's why we oppose.
Final leader of opposition for that speech to continue case for side government, Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Okay, I'll take my POIs in the chat between the 5th and 6th minute. Do not unmute under any circumstances. Just a quick disclaimer, trigger warning for abuse, suffering. And I just want to clarify that this does not reflect my personal beliefs, and that in case I I offend anyone by having to weigh issues or suffering as not that bad, I don't want to offend anyone. This is just for the sake of debate. In worry of forgetting anyone, no shout outs, but I love all of you, and you know that. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. David loses this debate because of his lack of defense of the counterfactual, his lack of acknowledgement that a capitalist society is far more horrible than anything they've talked about. But secondly, the reliance on intuition pumps that appeal to your liberal bias. We can laugh all we want about Amish people and how they are ignorantly blissful, but reality is they have happier lives than us average cogs in the capitalist machine. We people who escape to the debate community based on the communal value that discourse matters before we go back to the secular world of capitalism and our jobs and school tomorrow, and we go back to hating our lives. The first reason as to why they can't win this debate is that suffering and hatred is not mutually exclusive. Look at everything that David has said that happens in the secular world. Homophobia exists in the secular world, and so many people are forced to become straight passing instead because random outgroups will always hate on you. If you think religion is so bad, so much worse is a world where multiple religions tempt you, and therefore you don't know if you're going to hell or if you have to worship some god because being secular and is supposedly not enough. All of this is mutually exclusive, and even if they say, oh, at least to a certain extent there's less suffering, we'd say that that is not true. The suffering of resources is not taken in account of. In these small enclaves of communities, it's much easier to manage and everyone is provided for. Everyone has a niche and a role to keep these communities up and running, and therefore they're protected. This biological need supersedes any of the choice needs that they want on their side of the house, and therefore the suffering is much less on our side. The second thing, though, is that choice itself is not valuable. They simply assert this and appeal to your liberal bias. A certain genius in UADC 2021 proved that choice itself is not good because there's no true consent even in the secular world, right? All decisions are inherently coerced. It's all based on your nurture. You're based on the birth lottery and what circumstances you're based into. Your preferences for a job or your goals in life are based on your ability and your capacities to begin with, right? Your culture around you and the misfortune that forces you to do unethical things or unfulfilling things. What this proves to you it's basically that on your side, you don't have choice. People are pressured into STEM. I was pressured into debate because of my loud voice and my ego. And vices are more proximate to people who are suffering. And therefore, poor people do not choose to do crime. They don't choose to get addicted to drugs, but they're disproportionately more likely to have it. Since choice does not matter, what does matter in this debate? What matters is two things. Firstly is clarity. Look, they act as if it is so easy to succeed and there's a clear-cut path and such clear social support in a secular world. No, this is what the margin of the debate really is. Do you have the secular world where you have so many false gods and idols? You have multiple religions fighting with each other. You have capitalism directing you to do unfulfilling work that separates you from the means of reproduction and makes you feel like you're not doing anything productive because you're typing away at a computer. Where comparatively on our side, you are at least working on weaving. Even if you're an Amish person, you're weaving baskets and you basically are creating something that is fulfilling and you have much closer social ties. In your world, people cannot spend time with each other. You also have the patriarchy, which is instating gender norms and a lot of things that happen out of necessity, right? Everything is so uncertain. The only difference with these small communities and is not ethics or not morality or suffering. It is having a guiding voice of communal values. The guiding values that tell you that tradition is important, respecting your elders is important, and therefore if you put your community before yourself, everyone can make it and everyone can have a happy life. What this has is four major impacts that outweigh everything I haven't responded to from David. Firstly, the weight of decisions is off of you. You only have an illusion of choice on government, which means that everything in society, all the capitalist advertising, all of the patriarchy assertions are always confusing you and making you waste time on trying to find what you actually want to do in your life. On our side, you're given a very clear-cut path. Just respect your elders, worship this religion, and do your work. And therefore, you spend a lot less time confused and you do a lot more time working towards success. That makes it likelier to achieve success. But another reason why we have better success on our side is the standards of success. In capitalism, capitalism, you always have moving goalposts on what makes you happy, right? You're in the hedonic treadmill of wanting to pursue another job, pursuing another friend circle, having the most attractive romantic partner. And it's never clear when you can actually be happy with your life because advertising is always making you compare yourself to other people. On our side, you have achievable goals. Sure, the community tells you what you have to do, but they're achievable. Just abstain. Just don't attend church and make sure that you do your job in society. That means that people will have you, right? Ignorance is bliss. You can be happy with just having a wife and having some kids, even though you didn't really make a global change, because you cannot make global change anyway in capitalism. That is the problem. The third thing is insecurity. When you have this illusion of choice, what happens is you hate yourself. You think that it's your fault that you weren't good enough to compete with other people in the capitalist society. When on our side, if you suffer, at least you have communal values telling you, oh, this is my role. I may not have been the leader of the community, but that's okay because I was given my role. Even if I suffer, that is God's will. And even the most suffering and, the things that they force you not to do, your passions, at least it is fulfilling because you know you did your role and you fulfilled your obligation to everyone around you. It is not necessarily that you are a sinner or that you are being punished for your hardships, but simply that you are sacrificing for the community, and that is a great thing. The worst case that I have to engage on before I take the POI is the worst case in which you have arbitrary personality traits like being LGBT that gets you ostracized. The first thing is to just intuition pump that they are wrong, right? They said that a majority of people are in the minority. What the hell? No. But even if you are probably born with some arbitrary trait that makes you opposed to your community, the reality is that the socialization of your community and that ignorance makes it more likely that you move away from that part of your personality. You don't explore your sexuality. You don't even think of being ambitious as a woman, for example, and you just conform to what is safe and what is assured in terms of your success. Because if you're awakened to the reality, which is that, oh, I'm suffering, I want to pursue these things, in a secular world, all you would do is suffer more and just ponder your own subsistence. That is not better. That is existential dread that's much worse. POI now.
Let's take your example of the drug dealer that has no choice but to be poor. In your world, they feel much worse since they can never have that wife, since they can never fulfill that religious role, which means they're guaranteed to be deeply more unhappy.
Why are you not? Okay, so it's more likely that you will have achievable goals, right? Religions that just force you into unachievable goals fall apart. That's why generally the most popular religion is Christianity, which means that you just have to worship Jesus or try to be a good person, and there's still some forgiveness of sins. But more likely, again, like for you not to completely rebel against your community, there is some still level of communal obligation that you should protect each other at the end of the day, right? The average reasonable person should not believe that you will have extreme circumstances that push you to care the most about being LGBT. The more likely thing is you'll care about these basic things such as security, things such as clarity, because it's the prerequisite to all of these self-actualization. But in the worst case, we already told you from Bea that you can still have like social change on our side. The fact that you are communizing together, the fact you're so proximate to your religious members of your community, etc., your family members, means that you will collectively rise towards whatever social change you need to fight for. At the end of the day, what's unresponded from Bea is the idea of social support, right? I think that the most common thing among the average reasonable person is that they want to be loved. They want to make sure that people accept them because otherwise their personal successes will have no meaning. On our side, when you have the biological urge to be fed as the prerequisite to all of your benefits, but you also have people that are loved, we think that that is the most fulfilled life and that's the most assured.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Can everyone hear me? All right. Maybe my last major representing Ateneo. Hopefully, I'm not lying this time. So just wanted to shout out. Thank you to my instimates. Thank you to my girlfriend who is also watching. To my family who's been so supportive, and my mother for giving us food like the whole time we were here. Let's have a good debate. Let's start the speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to deal with their claim that you are much less likely to be structurally poor on their side because they have given little to no proof for this. The first thing to note is that they need to explain firstly that there is a huge correlation between the level of development of a community in comparison to the religiosity and degree of religiosity of that community. And the reason this is true is that when community leaders are no longer able to point to prosperity, to economic conditions, for reasons as to why you stay in communities, they use religion as the opium of the masses and tell you that the kind of hunger that you feel is a form of suffering that is worthwhile, that your fasting is a necessary sacrifice to show how devout you are to your religion. And what that entails is that this convinces multiple people not to rise up, not to change conditions, but still they are hungry and they suffer. Secondly, the high likelihood of conflict, precisely because the most religious areas are often done so because they have built a demonizing narrative against neighboring and rival communities, which is precisely why, even if you believe that there's going to be a support system for you, the threat of attack, the degree of anger, which is not a fun emotion to feel a lot of the time, is much more likely to ensure that you live in poor conditions as a consequence of conflict and the violence that you feel. Thirdly, even if these were communities that had such redistributive leaders that you could rise up when you had poor conditions that they do not prove at all at LO, I think the importance here is you just don't have the resources for that. Precisely because you have cut off the rest of the world. You do not engage in political systems. And what that entails is that governments do not allocate tax money to you. They do not give you resources, especially as the world continues to expand and there's less and less ways in which for you to be able to get that kind of money. I think it becomes harder and harder to feed a growing community that has more and more mouths, but not any form of additional production. The second thing I want to talk about is the degree of which poverty exists. Because on a degree of ability, they are much more likely to be structurally poor. But I think the problem is that, number one, there are just way more social safety nets on our side of the house, especially in secular societies where people have a greater ability to rise up, or protections in which they do so, and likely systems of accountability and governance that are more likely to ensure that if a majority of people in this country or community is not wealthy, that they suffer, they have the means by which they can take power. Whereas on their side of the house, you have additional barriers of either justifying that suffering or arbitrary religious narratives that are able to quell people who are not the higher ups within a religion. But next is that even assuming you're suffering on both sides, I think Riv says quite well, actually. You cannot get rid of the biological urges that you feel. The problem is when you feel hunger, when you are deeply unsatisfied with how you live your life, when you are forced into the same back-breaking labor that Bea says is meaningful, you feel guilt because these biological urges directly contradict what you are taught and socialized to believe in. And as a consequence of that, you cannot feel some kind of dissatisfaction about your poverty. You cannot feel any agency over the life in which you live. You are told it is enjoyable, it is meaningful, even if it makes you cry at night that you cannot do anything to fix it. The second thing I want to talk about is meaning and choices. The first thing to note here is that choices, precisely because they are challenged when there are many different options, are where people feel more affirmed in the choices and beliefs that they had, knowing that they tried something else that they weren't sure of whether or not they'd enjoy, they didn't, and they go back to their original choices. The fact that there are many people and communities built around these choices that tell you what parts of it to enjoy, how to enjoy them, how you're able to succeed in them. All of these mean that these choices, when they are challenged, when there's so many different options, are not as paralyzing as government says in this debate. In fact, it is when you know there could have been something else, when you know there could have been some kind of choice that you opted into at some point in life that is more likely to occur in government. And here's the important thing, because they rely on socialization being such a perfect mechanism when even the people in North Korea know for a fact they are suffering, know for a fact they're robbed of choice, know for a fact that they could possibly defect, they just do not want to risk their lives. Whenever you hear ideas from other communities, whenever it seeps through the internet or some kind of message, when you fall in love with someone outside of that religion, it is much more likely to be deeply hurtful knowing that you could not have done a single thing about it. Secondly, I want to explain, even if the comparative was a degree of capitalism, like obviously that isn't the main comparative. In fact, a lot of the time, secular societies are more likely to be redistributed for the reasons that I explained. I'll take you in like 1 minute. A lot of the time, capitalism has far more incentives to make you happy in comparison to these religious communities. And I want you to observe the incentive structures here. If I am a religious leader, I do not want you to feel consistently happy from being able to fulfill your religious obligations, because the reward you might feel from it might push you to work harder, to be more charismatic, and possibly be a threat to my power. And note that especially in a religious community that is tight-knit, that has fewer people, where the levers of power are much easier to turn as a consequence of this, you instead want to sow doubt, insecurity, and ensure nobody has the incentive to rise up the ranks and be the most devout and religious person outside of you, because you view that as a threat. Capitalism particularly has so many notions of ambition, the American dream, making something of yourself, knowing that it's a nation of immigrants, for example, that are one, not that hard to fulfill. That's precisely because they want to push you to work harder. They want to push you to buy their products, but at the same time, it's such a widespread system. They don't view you as a threat to power and therefore are willing to positively incentivize you through these means. Even if this was the comparative, I don't think they directly build it enough to be able to win on it. I'll take the POI.
There are so many poor capitalist countries, North Korea be damned. Why are you likely to be so opposed to basic physical labor when at least you see it as a path to success, whereas resisting capitalism, your best case, everyone who tries to do that gets eaten up by the system or dies trying.
I've pointed out the correlation between religiosity and why it is precisely the reason that it is so difficult to be in these countries, and that's what keeps them poor. In a largely secular society, it is far more likely of systems and ways for people to push for it. Lastly, I want to talk about systems of support. The first thing I think they ignore here is that systems of support require large amounts of self-sacrifice when you are not the one in need of support. You always have to be at their aid. You have to give up some of your dreams and ambitions for other people. You have to give up things because you need to stay in the community and serve the community, etc. So this, at best, is something that is like easily flippable on GOG. But the second thing to note here is that David does build the comparative, and Riv saying he doesn't like delete the argument, right? There are so many reasons the communities we built on our side are better. Number one, you can choose which ones you exist on. What are the primary identities that consist of them? But secondly, it's on a matter of power, because everybody in our world has an incentive to want to build communities because they want meaning. They want the same thing you can get out of a religious community. Because of that collective action that is needed, you have a large greater amount of leverage in these kinds of communities when they are not built on arbitrary systems of power, but instead on interdependence between peoples, knowing you could leave, knowing you can do something else, knowing that you need these friends and therefore you have to stay with each other. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the government whip. Here.
Hello. Is this good?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Can I move your papers? This one. Thank you. Okay. The reason why opposition loses this debate is because a lot of these circumstantial externalities they present, like for example, you being shackled by your religion, can also equally apply to the world, as we've demonstrated already from first speaker. Like for example, capitalism, making sure that you are never fulfilled, as also conceded by the previous speaker when they say that corporations always have the incentive to make you want to buy things because that's the only way you can get any form of fulfillment. For example, by constantly being in competition with others in an ideological setting, that you're competing on which religion is better, that you're competing on who's the better worker in your workplace. Therefore, a lot of the fulfillment or the shackling that they talk about equally apply under their side. They have done no weighing to prove as to why it is like asymmetric. There are four things I want to talk about at the top of my speech. Firstly, leader of opposition gives a lot of examples or reasons as to why individual religions are bad. But number two things. Firstly, all of these exist under their side as well. But the harm that we want to present here is that you are exposed to all of these at the exact same time during your formative years. Therefore, the harm of, for example, being confused, the harm of, for example, experiencing very bad forms of indoctrination are supersized even more under their side. Deputy Prime Minister, we talked about argued Deputy Prime Minister that even if this is true, it's unlikely to manifest in a bad way, that you are socialized through help your community, and communal values often mean uplifting everyone and not really subjecting one person to harsh treatment. So therefore, you're just unlikely to get that extra, that worst case. Second thing I want to clarify is that your community can be terrible and make you suffer. That is their claim. But two things I want to note here. First, there's no reasonable extents for us to assume under their side. That is, you probably have a community where you aren't torturing each other because the state won't intervene. So therefore, even if there is some form of oppression, it's unlikely to be in the way that they're talking about, which is like torture. But secondly, notice that in the community, if it's true that you're being controlled by one ideology or one leader, then obviously they have the incentive to make sure that you aren't, for example, in the uprise. Here's the debate winning characterization. Everyone has an aversion to pain. Everyone has an aversion to, for example, feeling constricted. So therefore, in the absolute worst case where they're torturing you, you probably know that you should not feel this way and are likely to revolt against that community. They're unlikely to make you go through that much suffering because it harms them. The form of radicalization. One, and this is important, look outside your liberal bias. They don't prove as to why this is bad. Secondly, notice how if they want to radicalize, the way that they do this is to your benefit. They want to cater to your needs. They want to give you better conditions because that is the way they justify, for example, harsher punishment, harsher rules, etc. So it probably means it's more benefit to you. But lastly, and this is important, this deals with a lot of the analysis from the previous speaker. Look at their examples. Maybe you can fall in love with a person that's outside your religion. Maybe, for example, a lot of these things happen. The point is all of these are outlandish conditions. What then should you win the debate? Number one, we told you that as an individual, what is more proximate to you are, for example, feelings of existential dread or financial anxiety, which are often inherent to your existence. Number two, look at how you have to weigh this. Look at the mental gymnastics that you have to go through in order for you to actualize their claims, as opposed to our side, where it's likely to be simpler and more likely for the actor in the debate to weigh this debate. First issue then, let's talk about individuals. There are a couple of pieces of framing you have to take note of. First is, statistically, you're more likely to be poor, part of a minority, or born with any type of disadvantage. Like, for example, maybe medical disadvantage, etc. And that's why this is important, because the average person who probably knows statistics probably wants to hedge against that risk. They say, what if you have a 90% chance of getting good life, but 10% chance of suffering? Weigh that against, for example, 100% of the time you are suffering because you're a minority in an oppressive community. Like, the average person will probably side with us. These circumstances of your birth are often uncertain. The welfare system, these systems of governance, etc., which is often the only support system for people in the instance where they have bad families, etc., always are extremely harmful. But more importantly, we tell you that these things aren't important under our side because you have an overwhelming communal presence that is likely to safeguard you from all external harms. Secondly, future experiences and existential dread. They say, for example, that under their side, you have means to, for example, uplift yourself. Truth is that people often don't do this. Since society is changing, oftentimes that means excluding out the vast majority of people, that you're being left by the economy, etc., that things are getting more expensive, inflation happens, all of those things. Under our side, at least you're guaranteed a decent quality of living. You have support systems for when you change and grow, when your beliefs can possibly change. For example, in the instance where you have more people to confide in the future. Hence, our debate impacts our debate winning in this argument. How did they engage? Number one, from first speaker, discontentment. They talk about the perverseness of religion. They talk about the hedonic treadmill, etc. But you have to weigh, right? A lot of these processes equally exist under our side. Why do we still win this deadlock? Number one, we prove you have less means of toxic comparisons, right? So under capitalist system, you have to constantly compare yourself with the people that you're working with. That means under our side, you're likely to be less competitive. So therefore, the discontentment, if equal on our side, does not at least get worse under our side because you're likely to be equally discontent for the rest of your life. Under your side, you're likely to fluctuate for the simple reason that you have more reasons to, for example, self-deprecate because you always have someone better that you can compare yourself to and feel shitty about. Secondly, they say globalization. They say globalization will infiltrate. Number one, no. A lot of these communities are actually really, really good at keeping globalization out, like Amish communities, as we pointed out. But secondly, there are extents of safeguarding, right? So for example, they probably have measures in place in the instance where you do have some outside influence you cannot control that enters your community. But lastly, this is important. This is in the perspective of the actor. It is less appealing to you. Why? Because your community and the perception of your community is that they meet all of your basic and demands of a quality life. Therefore, under their side, even if there's globalization, you're likely to view it pessimistically, or you're likely to view it as, for example, just something that you cannot tangibly want because everything that you want, everything that is desirable to you already currently exists to you in the first place. But lastly, on accountability, they say that because you can leave, we told you as to why already in the first part that we have successful accountability POI.
Okay, so if capitalism is inevitable and makes everything expensive, then your community that's deprived itself any capitalist means deliberately just cannot feed itself anymore.
I'll actually deal with this in the second issue. The second issue is more on the minority upliftment. Framing here that I want you to know is that if there's any, for example, revolution that is likely to take out the patriarchy or take out, for example, your white oppressors, it happens more than one lifetime. Why is this framing so important? Because the average person who is deciding in this motion is not able to view it as that much of consideration. My engagement with this issue is just engaging with their best case, but also the first issue should automatically win us a debate. Framing. Firstly, if you're a minority, you're more likely to be part of these communities as opposed to being against them. Why? Firstly, the desire to be tightly knit often comes out of the desire to resist, for example, oppression from the majority, etc. This is why, for example, they're so selective in who enters the community. But secondly, you want to keep outside exposure out of the community. When you're a majority, you're less likely to be worried about this, but also you have more people, so that the risk of this is higher. Secondly, this is no means of production. So a lot of the communes that we're talking about are often self-sustaining. You have, for example, one person that's like doing all of the livestock. You have another person that's getting all the food. You have another person that's all the cleaning. A lot of these rule assignments happen in a way that is likely to be productive and often does not require like outside intervention by the economy. For all of those reasons, we urge you to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Hello. For POIs, you can run upstairs and knock on the door if you're fast enough, or you can just do it through chat. I know, right? They're outside. All right, start in 3, 2, 1. Marx once touted religion as the opium of the masses. And while I may not entirely agree with that statement, I cannot deny that it has been the copium of the proposition throughout this entire debate. Their case requires you to believe that religions are capable of complete and total indoctrination, that they are so capable of complete and total isolation and self-sufficiency that you will never have room for doubt, never have any point in your life where you are convinced of other ideologies or convinced that your religious leaders may be wrong. This is simply an unrealistic and unfathomable case, which is why already in the vast majority of cases, proposition has lost. Perhaps it's true, you don't know who you'll be in the secular world, but to suggest that life would be better by diving headfirst into religious lunacy is just crazy. First issue then. What is life like inside the rubber room of religious isolation, and why is it better to be a rat in the rat race? The first thing I want to do is look at the specific attacks they launch against secular society and explain why they're actually quite minuscule. The first thing they say is, sometimes you will disagree with your neighbors, and that's bad. I would suggest that secular society was built to resolve these conflicts and has very many civilized ways of discussion in comparison to religious society, where often the consequence of disagreeing is just immediate ostracization and being exiled. But the second thing I'd point out is it's not clear to me why cognitive dissonance is bad, because in many instances, you need these new ideas to grow as a person and find the things you genuinely enjoy. I might not like ice skating and I might fall on my butt a lot of the time, but if I don't try it for the first time, I wouldn't be happy in that activity. There are many new experiences that can unlock a new sense of joy in you that you only discover once they are forced upon you by others, which is to suggest that in many instances, it's not a bad thing. The second attack they launch is to say, well, you might end up in a desperate economic situation without social support and safety nets. The first thing I'd point to is just the broad mitigation. The vast majority of secular societies are expanding social safety nets, even in the developing world, because there is a very strong electoral incentive, regardless of which side of the political divide you are on, to constantly expand these things to unlock new voters. We'd also point to trends like rising economic growth and like the rapid growth of modern economies, which suggest that more and more people are being uplifted out of poverty every year. The second thing to point out is even if you are a smaller cog in a larger community, the economic opportunities are also exponentially more abundant. Think about it. You don't have to be a baker or the person who is who is plowing the fields because those are the only 2 jobs available in your community. You might not be particularly good at those things. On the comparative in secular society, you can find your niche, and it's more likely that you turn to a living that you both enjoy and that is economically sustainable for you. You might be born into an Amish community with a brilliant mind for physics, but simply because the opportunities don't exist, you're never able to find what is actually meaningful for you. The third and final attack they launch is an attempt to symmetrize the debate, saying misogyny still exists, homophobia still exists, and the hedonic treadmill still exists. Just first gut check this. It's about extents, right? I don't think everyone in secular society is constantly depressed all the time. I'd suggest that the average person does find love. It's not true that even if you're a minority, you're suffering 100% of the time. And in fact, I'd point out that if anything, the fact that you are suffering a lot of the time makes the few happy experiences you have in secular society all the more beneficial and all the more important to you. But you wouldn't have those like happy experiences again if you didn't have the access to information that was built or the precondition for secular society in the first place. So even if it's true that there are still some problematic structures within secular society, one, they're easier to change over time, and two, it's easier to find little reprieves and escapes from them. Compare that now to an honest assessment of what life is like in these rubber rooms. The first thing we'd like to point out is that it's not actually as affirming and supportive as proposition suggests. These communities, by construction, tend to be poor. They're socially isolated. They move to geographically far-off areas which are hard to get to and hard to access, with very few resources and very few economic opportunities. Oftentimes, they pursue a strategy of complete and total economic isolation, like the average Amish community. It's not clear that they have a lot to provide you by the way of social services. Even if this is like the communal utopia that you guys fantasize it to be, what are they going to give you? One piece of bread? That's not enough for you to survive on a day-to-day basis. The second thing I'd point out is that this doesn't explain why the mechanisms these communities use is support and affirmation rather than shame and guilt. David makes the very nuanced argument here that it's easier to resort to values which shame you and guilt you into doing the thing that the leader in the community wants, rather than using reward mechanisms like social support and establishment. It's easier to make people content in their poverty than it is to actually try to uplift them from that poverty, which is why the average religious leader isn't going to resort to positive things like this. The second part of this is to just point out the minority case. Riv's one response is to say, well, even if you're a woman, you wouldn't even dream of being ambitious. If you're gay, you wouldn't even think of being gay as a thing. The problem is that they had to show this would be an airtight echo chamber. And we explained for so many different reasons, it was simply unlikely to be the case. The internet will at some point infiltrate you. Many religious communities force you to go out into the world through processes like Rumspringa. Even then, like your biological urges will at some point just kick in through your development. At that point, if you believe that you will even slightly question the values of your community, all of their harms of dissociation, of cognitive dissonance, of not knowing what you want to do in your life multiply, but they have no escape. And that is the worst possible thing for them. I'll take the POI.
So independent of the how, why is your incentive to perhaps ice skate or get a boyfriend outside of your religion precede your interest to have protections, given that you do not know how rich or poor or democratic or totalitarian the state you will be born into will be?
Because the average secular state is not particularly totalitarian or poor, because secularism, as we explained, is the specific mix of ideologies necessary to foster economic growth and development, right? The openness to new ideas and new peoples from different lands with different resources who are willing to trade and give you things is the kind of thing that usually leads to a good and prosperous economy, not religious isolationism. So life isn't that bad. Think about it. The final thing I want to do is take them at their best. Let's say you are completely religion-pilled. You absolutely want to drink the Kool-Aid of this cult. The problem, as we explained, firstly, is that the specific values you internalize are unlikely to be ones that make you happy. Even if it's true that you have a clear value system, and that might be better than the confusion you sometimes feel in secular society, that isn't a good thing if that value system leads you to self-resentment. It leads you to guilt. It leads you to feeling like you have a never-ending obligation. But secondly, as we point out, there is no true isolation, at least not for long. In the next 50, 60 years, do you really think these communities can continue to stay isolated? Or do you think the ideas will come to you? The doubt will start to creep in, but you are left with no real accountability and no real escape. Get out of the rubber room, welcome sanity. For those reasons, oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. It's now time for replies, starting with opposition reply. Here.
Can everyone see and hear me? Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2. The meaning you find, the justification of your suffering, the happiness with a mundane and uneventful life, all rests on Gov proving that socialization was such a perfect mechanism that all these things in your head are meaningful, are things that you ought believe in, rather than people just refusing to act up and act out of fear of punishment and ostracization of the only community that you know. I want to first deal with their claim on personal fulfillment. GovWeb says that seeing anything else, any other kind of idea, is outlandish. You'll never fall in love. These are such unreasonable things. When really, I think having a perfectly insulated community, where you have never once read a book or watched a movie, never once met someone outside of your community, never once have had an idea or thing that you could have possibly believed in enter your mind, even independent of having seen something outside of your own community, not once cross you. And that's the problem, because these things are likely to cause the same harm they have of confusion, of having different ideals that you might be exposed to, but never our benefit of affirmation, saying that being able to try many different things, or feeling that at least you have the choice and that it is attainable to gain different types of meaning, are likely to exist on their side of the house. So I think that's an incredibly unreasonable characterization, and any kind of doubt that seeps your mind is permanent on Gov. Secondly, we explain that there are many biological needs, that even if your religion forces and guilts you into thinking that your suffering is worthwhile, yes, you might not act up, but it won't change the fact that you feel hunger in your stomach. I think you have to be able to weigh on likelihood where you are more likely to get that kind of prosperity. Because a lot of the Gov push on up is just to say, well, what if you're poor? What if you're in these bad conditions? All these different things, little to no likelihood analysis, little to no structural reasons, etc. What we explain is that there is a high correlation between the building of a religious community and the lack of development, the lack of resources, the lack of prosperity, such that these things are much more likely to be problems on their side of the house, but also that the ability to build systems of welfare, of being able to garner some degree of protections against these harms, and even just the capacity to have resources at all, are things that are only provided for on our side. And I think another important thing is that even if you have their very generous characterization of having poverty on both sides, what we explain is that a poverty where you are guilted and feel so bad for thinking that this might not be right is a much worse off world to live in than on ours. Second thing I want to talk about is systems of social support. Because if you look at the PY from Bea, it's clear that they don't listen to our speeches. What they say is that our world has no support, you can't get the community, etc. We've explained from the start that there are both incentives to make communities precisely because of the reasons Gov names, but also a greater amount of leverage within your community as an individual. The ability to leave a community if it gets toxic or abusive. The ability to choose as to what lines exactly your community is built on is just far more likely on our side of the house. So if you thought this was at all an important benefit in this debate, I don't think they really build a meaningful comparative of, well, at least you have a system of support. They had to explain what was so unique about this particular system of support that it was absolutely necessary to do this. The last thing here is that there's an existential threat that David explains as to why these communities may not survive, that people could leave them. And as an individual, the decreasing ability for you to be able to find meaning in that community exists, and they have little to no response for it. Lastly is our comparative. I think what they do is they name a series of reasons as to why you can compare yourself with others, etc. And we give many reasons to why religions are structurally built on making you unhappy. I want you to look and weigh these analysis precisely on the basis of incentive. Why is it that unhappiness is so core and important to capitalism, reasons which they are unable to provide? But what we explain is that the power structures, the need to concentrate power within religious leaders is precisely the reason that you cannot be rewarded, you cannot be happy for fulfilling your religious obligation on Gov, and a negative incentive to keep you unhappy is what they need to be able to keep you continuing the religious behavior that they want. On all fronts, I think op wins.
I'm the speaker for that speech. To close this debate in case of said government reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The future is now. There are two untouched paths to victory that they barely respond to. The first one is we proved social support systems. And they realized that they didn't reply to this, which is why they tried to quickly build something at Mikko. All that Mikko says is, it's our burden to prove that our social support system is so important. But in reality, they don't really build alternatives. What we did tell to you is that capitalism itself is isolating. The fact that you have to compete with your peers to succeed, the fact that you have to move to a city and leave your family behind, and that there's no relatability between current generations if there is no such thing as communal values. On our side, when communal values tie people together, and sure, they force you to sacrifice your individuality, we unlock the most important benefit, which is not contested from us. It's the fact that you are loved, the fact that you are supported, and that other people will put the community before themselves in the same way that you do. And that will lead them to solve most of the problems that they have on opposition. That is a guaranteed benefit that they have not even tried to contest. The second thing that we win is the issue on clarity. Realize how flimsy their one-liner response to clarity is. They say, if you question even a little bit on opposition side, then if you question even a little bit on government, then you have no clarity at all. But realize that they say that chaos and certainty on their side is fine. You just use this uncertainty for self-exploration. No. If you say that clarity is so fragile, then you need to at least have a better extent. If their hand-wavy response to us is to say, oh, it's about extents, then sure, it's about extents. We have a greater extent of clarity on our world, and you're likely to be somewhat insulated, which means that my 4 levels of weighing, which are untouched, win you the debate. Firstly, the weight of decisions and the fact that you will waste less time self-discovering only to fail in the future, and you actually spend time working towards success, you will succeed. Secondly, the standards of success are much more attainable, and you're not likely to have bad standards for success because the religion will implode. No response to that from Tobi once we've clarified. Thirdly, insecurity. And fourthly, anxiety and uncertainty. This is the most important thing in the round, because if they want to frame that it's biological urges, I urge you to use your imagination. Mental health is just as important. Your ability to perceive happiness and fulfillment is dependent on your clarity. What you think through your ignorance is fulfilling for you is what matters the most. And when you are so insecure because of your comparison with other people, when you're so insecure because of capitalism and other religions tempting you away constantly through advertisements, etc., and you don't have these enclaves, then you don't have that mental health, and we already win the debate. Let's engage on all of the material since we already did it through all of our speakers. I just want to remind you, the first reason why they can't win is because of contradiction. Their silver bullet to us is to say indoctrination doesn't work completely, but realize that Mikko makes a rare mistake. He says that you have war with other communities, so you're likely to reject them. So therefore, the indoctrination will be successful. You are not going to be tempted by other communities because you are socialized to believe that they are not good. And when your community provides for all your basic needs, then you are not likely to want anything else. They also have other mechanizations like religion. If you say religion is so pernicious, then you will indeed have a complete indoctrination and we access all of our benefits. But even if that's not the case, what is the comparative? The comparative is constant questioning, right? Your inability to really know what is fulfilling in life and to have a direction in life, still no response to that on that. When they try to talk about social change, the reason why we also beat them on that is because this is an after motion, which it seems like most of their speakers forget. This is as an individual. Their only mechanism for changing capitalism is eventually rebelling against the system and transforming the system from within. That does not happen in one lifetime. The people who will reap the benefits are other people. And since they have not tied it back to the individual compared to our benefits, which are much more proximate, then it's much clearer for our win conditions to happen of mental health, of security, of clarity in your life. They are so speculative and they hang their case on so many assumptions. Meanwhile, on the other side, we don't need these levels of social change, and we've weighed to you the worst case. At least if you are an oppressed individual in these communities, if you're a minority, you will still have some sense of community obligation to not torture you, but you will also believe that, at least you have a way to actually succeed, whereas minorities have absolutely no way to succeed in a secular world. The king is dead, long live the king. That's not the quote.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Thank you to both teams for that debate. You can literally climb down the stairs or up the stairs and shake hands. Before judges move on, can I please quickly know the vetoes from both sides for the debate?
We vetoed Op vetoed the first motion on epistemic distance. I think, Gov vetoed the last motion on the end days.
Also, thanks for the round.
Oh, thank you for the round, yeah.
Okay, judges, we are moving to breakout room 8. Just picking a random room. Room 8.
Riva.
Thanks for the round, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Bye.
good luck.
Bye.
Hello.